We're talking about the subject of justice, and I thought it was appropriate to take a couple minutes here as we get ready to vote to signify a unique injustice that occurred in the state of Florida 70 years ago. In July of 1949, a white couple was driving their truck when it broke down on a rural road near Groveland, Florida. Two black men, Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard, stopped to help the couple. And what followed was a horrifying injustice that haunts Florida and truly the nation to this day. Norma Paget was the white woman in that truck. She was 17 years old. She told police that she had been abducted and raped by 4 black men. Many locals at the time doubted her story. Her estranged husband was known to be a drinker and to become violent with her. Many suspected she had made up these accusations to cover up for his abuse. The sheriff's office nevertheless detained 3 men for this alleged crime. Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard, the 2 men who had stopped to help the couple, were both World War II veterans. They both denied abducting or raping the woman. Nevertheless, they were detained and they were brutally beaten in the basement of the sheriff's office in the jail until they confessed to a crime they did not commit. A few days later, Mr. Shepard's family home was burned to the ground. A third man, 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, who was only 16, so really a boy, at the time that truck broke down, he was 20 miles away, a fact that was testified to by a store watchman. He didn't even know Mr. Irvin or Mr. Shepard. And the woman, his own husband, testified that he was not one of the 4 men that he alleges had brutally beaten him and abducted and raped his wife. But he too was taken to the basement of that jail and brutally beaten. A 4th man, Ernest Thomas, he was never arrested because he was hunted down over 30 hours by an armed posse of over 1,000 men, including the county sheriff. They found him sleeping under a tree in Madison County, Florida, and they shot him to death. Greenlee, Irvin, and Shepard were tried. The judge over that case denied their attorney access to exculpatory evidence. The judge in that case barred testimony about how they had been beaten until they confessed, and an all-white jury convicted them, sentenced Irvin and Shepard to death, and sentenced 16-year-old Greenlee to life in prison. Then a young attorney named Thurgood Marshall took up their case. He appealed it to the Supreme Court of the United States, which found that they did not receive a fair trial. In fact, Justice Robert Jackson said that the trial was, quote, one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice, end quote. The Supreme Court ordered a retrial. Well, a few months later, the same sheriff that was part of that posse picked up Mr. Irvin and Mr. Shepard from jail to transport them from prison to a hearing before the trial. Then he pulled over his car. He pulled the 2 men handcuffed to each other out of the car, and he shot them. Mr. Shepard died. Mr. Irvin played dead. The FBI later found evidence that he had been shot while laying on the ground, handcuffed to Mr. Shepard. By the way, lying wounded, his treatment was delayed because the hospital refused to transport him because he was a black man. Mr. Irvin was eventually retried and again convicted in another sham trial and again sentenced to death. By 1955, the facts of the case were so troubling that Florida Governor Leroy Collins commuted his sentence, took him off death row, and commuted his sentence to life in prison. Finally, in 1968, he was paroled by Governor Claude Kirk. 1 year later, Mr. Irvin returned to Lake County for a funeral. He was found dead in his car. Mr. Greenlee, the 16-year-old at the time of the manufactured crime, was paroled in 1960. He left Florida and died in April of 2012 at the age of 78. In 2017, the Florida legislature unanimously voted to issue what are now known as the Groveland Four, a formal and heartfelt apology, and they asked the state's cabinet to undertake an expedited review of the case and issue pardons. I come here today to talk about this case because while there's nothing we can do to give Mr. Thomas or Mr. Shepard back their lives, there's nothing we can do to give Mr. Urban or Mr. Greenlee back the years they spent in jail for a crime they did not commit, we can give these men back their good name. What we can do now as a state in Florida is seek the forgiveness of their families and of them for the grave injustice that was committed against them. And this is what I come here to the Senate today to urge the new Florida cabinet to do as soon as possible after they take office next month. Because after 70 years, it is time for Florida to do the right thing for the Groveland Four. Mr. President, I yield the floor.